Downing, sorry, grew up in Southern Trinidad, Northern Ontario, Brooklyn, and Kitchener. He is a musician, writer, activist based in Toronto. His 2010 debut novel, Lalaas, was published to critical acclaim. In 2017, he was named by the RBC Taylor Prize as one of Canada's top emerging authors for nonfiction. Sorry, I don't know what's happening with my screen. He performs and composes music as John Orpheus. Antonio's memoir, Saga Boy, that we will be discussing tonight, is full of creativity and transformation, a stunning mashup of memories and mythologies told in a gripping lyrical prose. We are so pleased to welcome Antonio Michael Downing to the Anti-O Book Club. Welcome, Antonio.
It's a pleasure.
So one of the main reasons that I chose this book was the sheer honesty of your story, even like in those ugly moments, you would say. It had such depth. I know that you did 250 hours, I think it was, of interviews to write the book. How hard was it for you to write the truth of what happened?
Well, they say intelligence is knowing the right thing to do, and wisdom is doing all the wrong things until there's nothing left. So it wasn't hard for me because at that point in my life, I'd kind of tried everything else and I felt stuck and I didn't know what the next thing would be for me in my life. And so it occurred to me that until I made peace with my past, that I couldn't continue into my future. So, you know, there are definitely technically challenging things about writing the book, emotionally challenging things about writing the book. But I feel like where I was in my life, everything about it felt necessary. And I think there's a certain ease in being in that position.
Mm-hmm. That is, yes, that is very true. And I think throughout the book, we see kind of your transformation and you getting from one place to another. So you begin the book and you end the book with "The Queen Designed My Brain." And one of the things that you share that I thought was very impactful and a bit jarring to others is how colonization impacted you on such a deep level. I don't think that many Canadians understand that. Can you shed a little bit of light on colonization and growing up in Trinidad?
Wow. I mean, a very small topic that's not relevant at all to today's news or last week's news anyway. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's like, you know, in Canada, we have a governor general. In Trinidad, we had a governor, which means no members of parliament, no laws, no agency, just rule by fiat, which, you know, and for us, that meant, in my lifetime, that meant the Queen. So when I grew up, when I opened my eyes on the world, every single person that was in my life had, especially my grandmother, who had lived almost her entire life as a chattel of the crown, basically. Mm-hmm. So, and I didn't know that growing up. What I knew was that I lived in a place where everyone had brown skin. But when I went to go to school, hovering motherly from the rafters of the school, right when you walk in, was Gloriana Regina herself, Queen Elizabeth II. Mm-hmm. So there was no doubt that we were part of something, but I didn't really understand what that meant. And then when I started reading my books, like these little red reader books, I have them there. I got them for research in Saga Boy. You know, by the time I was 6, I could tell you who Sir Francis Drake was. I could tell you why Odysseus took, you know, 10 years to get back from the Trojan War to Ithaca. I could tell you who Queen Elizabeth I and II was. I could tell you who Shakespeare was. And so it wasn't so much that there was two cultures or three cultures and one was better than the other. There was no second culture. European culture, English culture was culture. It was history. It was literature. So I wish I could tell you that, oh, you know, they biased us towards this, but they didn't bias us. They just erased us.
Erased. Yeah.
So, and you know, as Adler says, the famous developmental psychologist, by the time you're 6 years old, your personality is fully formed as a human being. So before I could even think for myself or even conceive of being a human in the world, I already understood that what the British crown was and what white skin was and what white culture was from the very beginning. And it was always the crown jewel of everything. And you know, of course, I living in Toronto, I came to realize that, yeah, and that's how Jamaicans think, and Nigerians, and people from Hong Kong, and people from South Africa, and people from Ireland, although they have a more complicated history because of proximity. But yeah, it's so for me, I said the Queen designed my brain because for me, I learned to read by reading the King James Bible. So the very logic and the very infrastructure of my brain was inhabited by the logic and the dance and the etymology and the rhythms and the inherent power structures of our language. So I consider it like my programming.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Yeah, I'll just move on from that. So I want to talk about Miss Exley's, and she was a force of a woman, and I probably love her so much because she reminds me of my own grandmother, my Jamaican grandmother growing up. And she was very much this, I guess, like stereotypical grandmother who learned on the Bible and who loved her hymns and prayers to get through like hardships. Do you think that she kind of fits in this trope of this strong Black woman that can carry everything? So do you think that trope was a dangerous one?
I mean, I don't know. I would say.
I do have a quote to go with that too.
Sure, let's hear
I will see it. Say it. For her life was a constant act of generosity and struggle. I grew up understanding that Caribbean women were deep wells of resistance from which all of them drew water. They were spiritually tough in almost a superhuman way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a reality. I mean, I think sometimes when things are just so true, they become cliche and they become tropes and they become, you know, we put them on pancake mix boxes. But the truth is, if that weren't true in the first place, like that was my reality. I mean, I grew up not, and for her, you know, she wasn't just everything to me, like mother, father, priest, confessor, disciplinarian, teacher, inspiration, ethical rule book. But I also watched her, like, for example, we have, you know, in Trini, we have unlike most Caribbean islands, we have a lot of East Indian folks. So I grew up around Hindu people, you know, people from Gujarat and Hindustan and Punjab, just regular. My best friend growing up was that. We celebrated Diwali. We didn't never celebrated Halloween. I never saw Halloween till I came here. So, but my grandma, there was a guy named Kenrick who kept coming over to my grandma's house. and he would bring her groceries. He would take her to the doctor. He would basically act in every way a loving son or grandson would to his grandmother, except Kenrick was Indian. And
Mhm.
I had no idea, like, why was this Indian guy? Like, clearly she can't be his grandmother. Like, what's going on? And the story of Kenrick, which I only learned writing this book, was that Kenrick was born in the very bed that I slept in every night the decade before. And why?
Mhm.
Why did that happen? Because Miss Exley, um, third world empire feminist that she started a school to teach young women how to sew, knit, and have these trades so that they could make their own money and
Mhm.
therefore eke out a kind of independence in a place that was, you know, pretty brutal for everybody with dark skin, less much women, like even more so.
Mhm.
Um, and this Indian girl got pregnant and her parents kicked her out of her house. And so, of course, Miss Exley took her in, and Henrik was born in the same bed that I
Oh my
slept in.
gosh.
And I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
And that's just one story. I mean, I could tell you many. And so I think the trope is based on reality. But in the case of my grandmother, it was extra real because she
Yeah.
really, really believed in that stuff in the Bible. Like most Christians I've met, quite frankly, were disappointing after meeting her because she really believed in helping people and turning the other cheek and giving what you have to people so that they can get ahead, and how you treat everyone else is how you is going to be akin to your riches and glory. And she really, really lived and believed that. And and I think so she was the trope to an unusual degree.
Mhm.
But again, I believe that the trope is, it's a trope because it happens a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. I would agree. Yeah. So through first Miss Exley's and then Auntie Joan, we see how these women really cling to their spirituality and singing hymns, and really finding that solace in Christianity. Um, and that has a huge, huge legacy in the Black community. So how has that played a part in your life, like even now?
Her legacy.
The legacy of Christianity and spirituality, and really the singing of hymns. Like there's one scene where Auntie Joan was upset and she just went to her hymns. Like she really
Yeah.
clung to those hymns. And I find myself even doing that. And I'm not Christian, but sometimes you just need that little push.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, so she taught me two great things. She taught me, well, I mean, I guess the first thing is, if you grow up in an ethical structure, that's something we all need.
Mhm.
And however we get it, it doesn't matter as long as you learn at some point to treat people the way you want to be treated.
Yeah.
Have a sense of ethics around, like the basics. Don't steal from people, don't do people things you don't want them to be done to you, don't be violent to people. Like, these are the basics. And as a moral code, that stuff's been, it's universal and it's eternal. Like, almost every culture had those same rules. How they punished it was varied, but they had those same rules. So that aside, specifically to Christianity, I I don't know. I see my grandmother and my Aunt Joan more like Stoic philosophers.
Mm.
They were people that, in Stoicism, they talk about bearing what's coming to you, focusing on what you can control,
Mm.
not worrying about what you can't control. Now, their mechanism for doing that was to pray and say, Jesus, I leave it at your door. But
Mhm.
actually, all that did was gave them the green light to activate the power, the strength they already had inside, to not take things personally, to be a poor woman and still give, to have nothing and still figure out how to give, to invent ways to help people, to take in people that you couldn't your grandchildren. You're 80 years old. What business do you have taking in these two grandchildren? So I think I see them as Stoic philosophers, and Christianity was just a language that they used. And the singing, I mean, come on, singing feels great. Singing feels great and feels powerful. You're breathing, you're in the moment, you forget everything. And just, I mean, singing is great medicine for transmuting suffering into gold. So I don't, and the hymns in particular, they access, they have a reflectiveness that access a part of us that probably existed a long time before that dude in Nazareth died on the cross. Like, it's just part of us, and that's just the language we use. Like, Sexley had a hymn. She would say, I remember always, she would be sitting there and she'd just be looking out into the distance, and Auntie Joan used to tell me this story about her. She'd say, but I remember her singing the hymn, and she would say, "Mama, what are you looking at?" And she would say, "Child, I'm thinking about my dying days." And this is kind of the fundamental philosophy, right? It's samurai talk. I must make peace with my death if I am to truly live. So she didn't see it as morbid. And she would hit up a hymn like, I'm gonna try to do it for you. It goes, "Will there be any stars in my crown? When at evening the sun goeth down, and though I lay myself in the mansion of rest, will there be any stars in my crown?" And it's like, I mean, it doesn't matter. The philosophy behind it doesn't matter. It's just the way the words are structured and the way the melodies are structured unlocks a certain part that brings peace. That's a catharsis for what's difficult and what's ailing us. And I think that's what she was teaching me, is how do you transmute pain into perspective? And so that, I think, is the legacy of Christianity in terms of, Black people love their Jesus, but I think it's a lot of my experience with it is that it's very like, the problem is I learned to read reading that Bible, and she was my living example. So as a teenager, when I met like real Christians, they were like, turn the other cheek. No, they were vengeful. Don't judge. They were always looking at your shoes, and is your shirt, did you press your shirt? And what kind of car did you come up here in? And, it was the most petty, most vicious, most unchristian environment I've ever been in. And, I was a rock and roll musician. I've been in some unchristian environments. And so I was just disappointed because I knew that they weren't following the letter or the spirit of the law. And so I just labeled Christianity as hypocritical and Black Christians as deluded. And it was a long time before I could reconnect with the spiritual transmutation of the language and the singing and the numinous space that it creates. Without getting caught up on the language, because the language is just, beauty in Russian or English is still beauty, whatever language you used to say it in. And once I got that perspective, that allowed me to access the things, not so much the Christianity, but the things that Christianity was pointing to.
Yes, that is powerful. So this Exley passes away. And you are plucked from Trinidad to go to this cold, remote part of Canada, where you went from being amongst all these Black people to being like the only Black face. So that's like cultural shock galore, right? So what did you learn about Blackness in that season of your life?
Um, First of all, I don't know if that lady passed away because I feel like she's still talking to me all the time. Yeah, and second of all, I mean, it's not a remote part of Canada. It's actually part of this province. It's just
Yes, it's
as
just remote.
yeah, it's just up there a piece. It's just down the road if the Trans Canada could be considered a road. Yeah, I think, a lot. I mean, what did I learn about Blackness? I don't know if it's so much about Blackness as I learned about myself. And Black is just one. I know the trend is to cloak ourselves in our Blackness as if that is the only thing we are, but we are children, we are lovers, we are nephews, we are employers, employees, citizens, we are many other things. And everything I was when I got to Northern Ontario was suddenly yanked away. Like I
Mhm.
literally fell asleep in a rainforest in the bush, um, just down the road from the crocodiles and the pythons, and I woke up in a blizzard. And I had never seen that before. And that was a dramatic displacement of self.
Mhm.
Everything was gone. She was gone. The country was gone. The people were gone. The language was gone. And it was replaced by, in a way, I was shocked. Icicles. I mean, I tell people this and they just don't get it. See, in the Caribbean, ice outside the freezer melts every time. It's a law of physics. Like it just melts. There's no option where it doesn't melt. And so I would spend like an hour just staring at icicles going,
What's
that
happening?
ice is not melting, and in fact it's getting bigger. How does that happen? And so, I mean, beyond Blackness, it was a catastrophe of displacement of the self, of culture, of life, of somebody shouting out Thunder Bay and Fort Francis. I'm talking like Dryden, Sioux Lookout, Ignace, Red Lake, Lake of the Woods, Kenora. I know these places. I tell you what, it was a great place to understand Canada because at the
Mhm.
time, that's what I thought Canada was. And when I could step back and got over the shock, there were a couple of things that stood out. Number one, living in a town like Sioux Lookout, which was half indigenous, so a city of about 8,000 people, 50% Anishinaabe, 50% everyone else, settlers. That was my first view of Canada.
Mhm.
And I experienced firsthand. Well, I went to, now imagine, remember what I just told you about being in remote Trinidad and everyone's dark skin, and when you walk into the school, there's a big picture of Queen Elizabeth, who just deceased, staring down at you. Now everything in my life changes. I used to be in the bush with snakes and pythons and crocodiles. Now there's wolves and bears at the dump, and moose. Every now and then you'd spot them, and it was like never seen nothing that big and alive. And everything's changed.
Mhm.
Icicles, my God. And I, that year, attended Queen Elizabeth District High School in Sioux Lookout. And when I walked into the school, who was staring down at me from the
The
top of the
queen.
foyer?
The queen.
Same queen.
Yeah.
So that was the only thing that stayed the same in my life, was colonialism. And I immediately understood that everything I thought I knew about indigenous people in this country was wrong. And I
Mhm.
immediately understood that the same queen that was confusing the hell out of me was confusing the hell out of them with the same policies and the same ways of moving. And so I guess the and the way white people would treat the indigenous people would be awful. Like they
Yeah.
literally throw stuff from trucks at them and yell at them in the street. And I was at this crossroads where my Aunt Joan worked with the indigenous community, but she also went to her church full of white people. And so I was kind of, they just didn't know what to do with me.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, I got to see a bit of both of those worlds. I went to powwows. We had boarders who came from because if you've read Tanya Talaga's incredible book Seven Fallen Feathers, you know that a lot of indigenous folk fly down from the reserves to go to school in the town because they don't have high schools. And so we had boarders there. And so I really got that mix. And then I guess the final thing was that a lot of people, Black to people in which I think is still true of most of Canada, was basically what they had encountered in the media. It wasn't lived experience.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a pressure to be that Black person. It's like, wow, you don't act like any of the people in any of the
In the
movies,
hip hop videos or
in
the
any of the
movies.
movies we see or any of the videos. It's like, this kid, he doesn't talk jive, and he keeps wearing church sweaters, dorky church sweaters, and then he wants to listen to heavy metal. Did we keep the receipt for him? So those are the things I learned, just sort of in that lens. But I guess the fundamental thing for me was I learned that it sent me on a quest to understand myself, because if you ask someone if they know themselves, they say, of course I do. And then you ask them, well, who are you? And they will very quickly start telling you about where they grew up,
Yeah.
who their father was, what did they study in school, what music they listen, how they like to dress. But I had all of those things taken away from me, and I still existed, which
Mm-hmm.
which cemented in my consciousness the fact that home is not a physical place.
Mm.
And none of those things that we typically define ourselves by are actually valid, because if they can be taken away and you're still here, then clearly they are not who you are or whatever you are. And that I think galvanized my consciousness in a way that pretty much I never forgot.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, you could sum up my life by saying I tried to figure out who I really was by using the gifts my grandmother gave me, which were books and songs.
Mm-hmm. And this theme of home and family comes up a lot in your life. Um, One of the things we get to see is you kind of searching for that home and searching for that family. You search for that when you went to go stay with those few families, when coach takes you in, and then when you finally get your mom and your dad under the same roof, this kind of unorthodox family unit. Um, I have a quote that I love. It is, "In the land of abandonment, there are no half brothers. So many of us were raised by grandmothers, aunties, older sisters, stepmothers, or distant cousins that the Caribbean family was often a hodgepodge, a palau, a mix of odds and ends. You found family where you could, and if you had the same mother, you were brothers, and that was that."
Yeah. You know what? I'll give you all a peek behind the curtain. I added that line in at almost in the final edit of the book, because my editor, Diane Turbide, retired from Penguin Random House. Fabulous editor, legend, actually, I would say. She, like a good editor, said, well, wait a minute. You're calling him you're calling him your brother, but actually, isn't he your half brother? And I was like, and I had to stop and think about it and laugh about it. I'm like, this, because I realized we'd hit one of those, what W.E.B. Du Bois would call the veil between
Yes.
white experience and Black
Yep.
experience. And what I boiled it down to is that, and maybe some people here can confirm or deny, but I think that when there's something to inherit, you get really particular about who's in and out, don't you? So you can't just go labeling every little the Tom, Dick, and Harry brother or family, because they gonna come for their share.
Yeah.
When you don't got nothing to yeah, y'all
Everyone's your
come on.
brother or your cousin.
Yeah, come on, we're all struggling down here. But yeah, to that end, I never ever saw any of my half brothers as a half brother. Like there's
Mhm.
none of that. Like there's just no distinction. It's never existed. And I thought that's interesting because I recognized it. So that started me thinking deeper about family and home, and that's why I added that, but it plugged into a lot of deeper themes.
Yeah.
And yeah, you're right. I think that there's a different sense of community, um, especially growing up in rural areas like I did when I was a kid in Trinidad. It was always, Miss Isla, can I borrow a pound of flour for Miss Exley or 2 cup of sugar,
Yep.
till next week, please God. And that's just how you lived.
Yeah.
It was kind of natural socialism. Everyone was just sharing, and there wasn't really anything to it. And I still struggle with that. I had a white girlfriend broke up with me because she felt that I didn't really have as finely tuned a sense of each sort of sharing 50% the cost of everything. And because I just grew up in a place where it was like, yeah, you just talk about that. But
Mhm.
in our society, it's like intrinsic. You're supposed to just know, and you're supposed to almost be extra apologetic about being, oh no, this is yours, and it's really important that I don't infringe on what's yours, and that I carry my share and 50. And it's not that I don't agree with the equality of sharing. It's just I have a different concept of
Yeah.
sharing,
Yeah.
because which doesn't count things as closely. It doesn't count things as closely. But I mean, for me, and to that end, I moved back to Kitchener during the pandemic, which I left for, well, if you know anything about Kitchener, you would know why I left. And one of the best parts is, like, coach, I'll bump into Elaine when I'm just going for a morning walk, and we'll just talk about literature for some time and just keep, or coach will just drop a note, a newspaper clipping in my mailbox, said, hey, I saw this. And the two things I've done most in my life is play music and play basketball. And my mom and dad, have never seen me do either, ever.
That's crazy.
Coach and Elaine, they wanted to get on every single thing that had to do with Saga Boy. They were so proud.
Mhm.
It's like my barber said, I bumped into Coach because he used to play ball. I bumped into him on the golf course, and he wouldn't stop talking about the book. He was asking strangers, did you get it? Did you? It's like this awkward, like, proud parenting that I never had.
Yeah.
Like, every book club, they're trying to get on it. It got to a point where I just sent them Penguin Random House's, like, your upcoming press appearances. I was just like, here you go, because I'm surprised they're not here right now. And it's just you just realize that I have a great relationship with my parents now, because I don't depend on them to be parents.
Yeah.
They're just people who are related to me and who I share a story with. And I can just appreciate them for that, because I don't need them to nurture me in that way. Because, like you said, I found it where it was offered, and which is just like, I don't know many high school teachers who take in students. I
Mhm.
I can't think of any other. And I honestly think there's no coincidence that Miss Exley took in so many people and said so many prayers for me to be taken care of. I feel like I'm living off of her prayers. that she
Oh,
prayed.
that was my last question.
Yeah, well, there you go. Yeah, I just feel like I'm still floating off, like Jay-Z said, I'm still spending money from 88.
Yeah.
I'm still spending the prayers that she prayed, in a kind of deadly earnestness, since she died in 86. So that's how I feel.
So I have more questions, but I also wanted to open it up to anyone who has the question. They can put it in the chat so I don't take all the time. But if
Yeah,
no one has one, I have more.
the chat's bumping. Yo, I haven't even been looking at the chat. I'm sorry, the chat's bumping.
Neither was I, actually.
I did shout out to Thunder Bay Fort Francis. Hadn't considered the capitalist roots of half siblings. Yeah. Right? You ever see what full siblings do when someone passes and there's money to split up? Yeah, it gets you
Gets sticky.
You really get to know people. um yeah.
I also wanted to speak about generational curses. And there is a part when your brothers were deported back to Trinidad, and you talk about the cycle repeating itself. The abandoned kids were abandoning their kids. So how has this generational pain played a part in your story?
Yeah, I don't think it needs a metaphysical explanation. I think it's like the same way wealth, like, look, I know my fair share of waste man. And by the way, let me translate.
I don't know if people know what waste man
Let
are.
me translate a waste man. Waste man. Shiftless. Displaying a minimal sense of responsibility. Incapable of taking care of themselves to any competent degree. Waste mans. So I know my share of white waste man youth who have never tried to be ambitious or hardworking or anything. And their parents are going to pass away and they're going to inherit so much money, whatever ridiculous belief, set, lifestyle they've chosen to live will be suddenly validated. And because they know that, and because everybody knows that, this is a great source of their privilege. And trauma is the same way. Trauma gets handed down like the family property and the family jewels. Like the Koh-i-Noor, we stole that. We just gonna hand it down as part of our glory. But the trauma on the other side, y'all get that reference? I'm taking shots at the queen. They say don't mock the dead, but I'm taking shots. The Koh-i-Noor jewel is a jewel stolen from India worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Newsflash, they ain't giving it back.
Yeah.
But that's the flip side, right? And so I don't think it needs a metaphysical explanation of a curse or whatnot. I just think that it's when trauma hurt people, yeah. and we hurt the ones closest to us. And so, if you're the son or daughter or descendant of hurt people, you get hurt, and then you in turn hurt people that are close to you, unless by some miracle the cycle breaks. I mean, my Coach and Elaine are beautiful. I'm so glad they're in my life, but I also recognize that I've never even heard of another teacher that took their kids in, and struggling kid into their house. I've never even heard of that. So it is clearly the exception, and that's clearly benefited me greatly. But what about all the people who haven't had that? And in my family, I've seen that. I've seen my brother, be addicted to drugs. I've seen my brother get involved in gangs and going to jail, and the abandonment is a big thing. Like, so what's happened in this last year is, I don't know if you remember the scene where I come in and the family reunites near the end, and my brother's daughter is holding my dad's daughter,
Yes.
who is now Eve is now 10. More on her in a second. And Aunt Joan comes back, and it's kind of like this weird family reunion. And so that daughter, that my brother's daughter, who he basically denied being a parent to for
Yeah.
a long time, and they reconciled at some point, and she passed away last summer at the age of 25 from a drug overdose.
Oh, my condolences.
Yeah, and thank you. I felt like when I was at that funeral, it felt like we were passing something on.
Yeah.
Because even though we all didn't know her, it felt like we all had failed her. And Aunt Joan passed away on Christmas Eve.
Mm.
And like the true Stoic philosopher she was, she told no one that she was sick. Like she had a metastasized cancer. She didn't tell anyone, not a soul. Not, in fact, she was talking to everyone, supporting everyone else the whole time. In fact, the very last thing she did was to call Eve, who was named Eve because she was born on Christmas Eve. The last thing she did that I've confirmed is that she called Eve on Christmas Eve to sing her happy birthday, because she knew that her brother, my father, wouldn't. And she didn't want her to go without some love from our side of the family. And then she promptly passed away.
Wow. Oh,
So, so all kind of thing getting passed on.
all kind of thing. Okay, so we got some questions, less about Saga Boy, but more about your journey as a writer. At what point did you decide you wanted to write this book? And what steps did you take to make it happen? A question for aspiring writers.
My goodness, thank goodness. Oh my God. This is why I never wanted to write a memoir, because then everyone just asks you about your life. I like writing. I really am a big fan of writing. You can't see it, but there's a massive bookshelf here. There's a massive bookshelf here. I just sold a novel to Simon and Schuster. I have 2 children's books coming out. I'm halfway through a book of essays. So I'm a writer. Surprisingly, my expertise, I would say that's my real expertise. And it's a good point. Like people of color, we're always expected to be experts on people of color, but actually but we don't do that to white people. Like, tell us the state of white people. Could you just break it down for me? Like,
not the state of white people.
Yeah, I mean, and the joke is, I have a degree in English literature. I could tell you the state of white people more than most people. So yeah, let's talk craft. Let's chop it up. So, I kind of always had it in the back of my head to do it, mostly because art is how I process. So, I'd spent a lot of time writing songs and doing music, and I was just like, okay, this one might be too big. A 3-minute pop song might not handle all of this drama. So I started writing a novel in the summer of 2018, but it was kind of a world creation novel. And so it's kind of like you got to stay really immersed in it. And then I got really busy, so I couldn't be immersed in it. I thought, oh, you know what's easier to do? A memoir. I should do that memoir because it'll be easier, right? Because
how did that work out? I don't know if it was easier.
Yeah, it wasn't that. Don't say that. Yeah, that's nonsense. Yeah, technically it was super. So you have 2 sets of problems with a memoir, right? So immediately I just started going, well, what are the stories I remember? And the stories pre-Canada were all that was left from my childhood. And so, like, you know, some of us can just drive down the street we used to live on or visit the school we used to, all of that's gone. So all I had were the stories. So I would tell them almost obsessively to my close friends over the decades, um, almost like I was trying to preserve them in amber so they wouldn't disappear, so I wouldn't forget them and lose my childhood. So when it came to writing those were just easy. They just poured out pretty much what you read in the book is what came out. But keep in mind, I'd spent decades refining the telling, testing them out on audiences, seeing what worked and didn't work. I had figured those out a long time before, with the exception of the part on sexual abuse, which I kind of had blotted out in my memory. And then the rest of it was really hard to access. So as Lala talked about earlier, I did 250 interviews for a couple reasons. Number one, I wanted to fact check myself because I realized, so first thing I did, I read about 30 memoirs. Some of them I'd read before, I reread them. And I also read the story of those memoirs and how they came to be and what were the struggles and challenges with them. So I think 30 might be like book nerd obsessive. I don't think you need to do that. But it's important to understand the kinds of things that happen when you write a book, because if you tell your story, unless you've been living in a cave, in which case no one wants to hear your story. But if you tell your story, well, that's not true. I'll take that back. But it's also other people's story.
Mm-hmm.
So you have this thing where, again, Tanya Talaga, my friend, her and I talk about this many times about being the keeper of other people's stories, which is a grave responsibility. And you quickly realize, once I did that, I realized, okay, if I didn't engage people in the process, people are going to be pissed off anyway, for a lot of reasons. Some people just aren't used to, you know, the big thing about memory is that memory is not this precise recording of our history as we think it is. We think, I remember it, it happened like this, and that's the exact way it happened. But in actuality, that's not how memory works. Every time we remember, we create the memory anew and we edit it. So things become, we invent things, we delete things, we expand things, we compress things. Usually what serves our own egos. So memory is a kind of a record of our frailty. This is important when doing a memoir because your memory will inevitably differ from other people's, and people are very protective of their version of the story. So that's why, so that's the first reason I thought, okay, here's how I'm going to deal with this. I'm going to engage everyone so that they can have input, they can jog my memory, they can fact check me. And if there's something they don't want, that they have a problem with, you know, they can at least tell me and I can decide, hey, am I going to take this out or not take it out? So that's a really important part of doing memoir work, is to do sort of the deep work. The other thing I realized was that, and people always say, why are you so compassionate to people that have done terrible things to you? And here's the thing, if you're writing a memoir to settle scores, A, is going to be boring.
Mm-hmm.
And B, you're probably not ready to write that book.
Yeah.
Go do the work and then come back when you're ready.
Yeah.
So on everything I'm talking about is sort of the emotional dimensions of it. Now, when we get to sort of the technical aspects of it, what I realize is a lot of us, when we start writing, we think we got to get into our writerly voice. And it's not that. I think what you find is if you can speak the story, you can write the story.
Mm-hmm.
So I recommend simply just tell it and write what you would say, and don't worry about being a writer, right? Because that's when we start using all these conventions and things that are there to decorate itself, things that are there to draw attention to itself. But the story needs no adornment. And at the beginning of my book, I say, let the sweet be sweet, let the sour be sour, let the truth ring its own bell.
Yep.
And then structure wise, I split it up into acts, kind of like an opera would be, or a Shakespearean play, kind of a 5-act structure. And that was more because I saw the grand sort of sections of my life fitting into that, but also I wanted to keep this idea of the European overlay on my life, like the Queen designed my brain. So I wanted that to be present there, like the overture, for example, very much associated with European opera. And then the actual writing. I mean, once you have your structure, and if you're starting from scratch, I would recommend you write the story of your life in 25 sentences. Just do a sentence for each, and do it chronologically, and probably that's the chapters of your book right there.
Hmm.
You have an outline for your book. I changed mine many times, but in the end, I ended up deleting most of the stuff that I added after. So then in terms of writing, yeah, I would recommend tell it plain. I think the problem, and this is the hard part about memoir, is you have to relive it. To really understand it, you have to relive it, because memory is locked up with what we smell, what we taste, the way how did the bush sound in Trinidad? I can remember it.
Mm-hmm.
Sound of the wind in the grass, the sound of the night in summer, the sound of a sugarcane field, the smell of a sugarcane field, the smell in the rainy season after the rain is washed away and it's washed everything onto the streets, from bloated snakes to rotten mangoes, like that smell. Right? I can remember it. I can see it. And you kind of have to it's almost like you're living it again and you're seeing it again. So for me, it's akin to dreaming. I want to walk back into the reality and see it again as if for the first time. So I'm always asking myself, what do you see? And it's not just sight, it's all the senses, which I recommend is a important thing, is that you don't focus on sight, just because we tend to as writers. But in truth, memory is unlocked in, I think smell has, for me anyway, smell has a huge trigger for memories for me. So does sounds. So embrace all your senses. And then I guess the final thing I'll say is, you have to try to reach for something that is beyond you. You have to try to access the universal through the personal. So, because at the end of the day, it's not you that's living the stuff that people are reading. They're reading you at the end, looking back. And so with that eye looking back, you have to resurrect, like Raina Maria Rilke in Letters to a Young Poet talks about resurrecting the sunken wrecks of our childhood. And you have to pull up the things that really have a sense of beauty, a sense of what is deep and what is at the core and what is human, And so for me, the success of Saga Boy is that, people who are not Black, Caribbean, immigrant, and male still see themselves in the book.
Mm.
because essentially it's not about any of those things. What it really is about is our shared humanity. But that's what all art is about.
Yep.
And I think you have to get in touch with that. And you have to, when you're telling a personal story, it's harder to do that because you're not shaping it as that. But you have to tell yourself, you have to see your story in a human context, in our shared humanity context, because that's what really matters. And to the extent you do that is to the extent that anyone's going to want to read it. So there's some thoughts on process,
That's
structure.
Great advice. Great advice. So I just have two more things. We do want to take a group picture, but we also want to ask you to recommend what are some of your personal book recommendations? I personally hate this question because I read so much that I can never give an answer. I'm just like, what am I reading right now?
You mean like today?
Yeah.
That's really, really
it's a difficult question for us avid readers.
That's difficult to do. I mean, I read nonfiction as much as fiction. I read old books more than I read new books. So if you're looking for the new hot book that's coming out from me, it's like highly unlikely. To me, so I love reading history. I love reading philosophy. I love reading psychology. And then of course, fiction and poetry and plays even. So no particular order. I will put it in the chat so everybody can not think that I'm crazy. I would say if you like my memoir, then I would read Kiese Lehman's Heavy.
Yeah. Chelsea had recommended that to me last year too.
Yeah.
Yes.
I had a crazy experience with that book because I was sort of getting into writing Saga Boy, and I read a New York Times review of it, and I was like, I have to stop everything I'm doing and read this book before I write another word, which I did. And the whole way through Saga Boy, I was like, if you ever think that you're being vulnerable enough, think about this book, which I did. And then the incredible thing is that Brother Kiese wrote a endorsement of my book. So he read my book that I was inspired by his book in creating, and he read he wrote the most glowing book jacket endorsement I've ever read on anyone's book. And so I have a great feeling with that. But Heavy, certainly from a memoir standpoint, is really tremendous. I really if you're thinking, if I'm just because it's in front of me, but also because this is always with me. So Kinesia Lubrin's, who's a St. Lucian Canadian writer, Voodoo Hypothesis, and that's poetry. So just so you know, Audre Lorde, her book Zami, and also Audre Lorde's Black Unicorn, which is my constant companion.
Good books.
Which I love. There's so many things. I really love James Joyce. I don't know if people still read James Joyce, but James Joyce's Dubliners is something I really enjoy. My goodness, there's just so many books. And of course, I'm going to walk out of this room and there's going to be they're all sitting on my stand there. Yeah, I mean, these are big for me. There are more things. I recently read Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom, which I thought was amazing. Yeah. I had a very strange experience with Andrew Roberts' Churchill, which is a biography of Winston Churchill. I was going to England and in the end of May. And while I was there, they were getting ready for the 70th Jubilee, which of course made me conflicted as AF. And but I was in the country, I was walking around, people putting up bunting for the Jubilee, and I was like, okay, I want to read this Churchill bio because I really want to understand. Like, Churchill is a figure that straddles like Victorian England, the previous longest reigning monarch. And he was born under Victoria, lived under all the kings, and lived under Elizabeth, died under Elizabeth. And everything the British Empire was doing, he participated in, not as a side act. He was right in the hot center of it all. World War II famously being the big one. So like the Boer War, World War I, you know, the Depression, World War II, the Cold War, he's right in the center of it. So I really wanted to understand those things. So I think if you want to understand sort of the British perspective of those things, and Churchill is magnificent with words, which I really love because he, you know, he's old fat colonizer that he is. He's really great at the language. And so I really wanted to appreciate that. So, and then oddly enough, I finished the book. It's a 60-hour audiobook. So I finished.
Wow.
Yeah, I read big books. I love big books. And so I finish it this weekend, and it finishes with his funeral, which was the last state funeral before the one that happened a few days before I finished.
Oh my gosh.
So the Queen and Churchill were wrapped up in the beginning of this book and in the ending of it. So I don't know what that's done to my brain, but yeah, he has a very, there's one of these arcane jobs they have called the Privy Seal. And he hated the Privy Seal at one point when he was Prime Minister. So the Privy Seal comes to Downing Street looking for him, and he said, Prime Minister, the Privy Seal is here. He says, tell the Lord Privy Seal that I am sealed in the privy and can only deal with one shit at a time. Anyway, I loved it for that reason. But I mean, yeah, so many books. I really, Marlon James, Brief History of Seven Killings, I read this summer as well.
That's such a good book, one of my favorites.
Yeah, tremendous book. Love Marlon James, you know, which I would recommend. I'm not going to recommend any crazy philosophy books because probably that's not your thing. I was reading History of Western Philosophy because I had all these gaps in my knowledge of philosophy, so I wanted to fill it in. Whew. It's exhilarating, and it's also just like so tunnel vision. Very interesting. But anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. Those are some great recommendations. It's been a great conversation. I want to take a quick picture. Nikki, do you want to do that? Chelsea? If anyone has their books, please.
Can I put on my...
Hold them up. Hold them up.
Can I put my hoodie on? Hold on.
I feel like you have to now.
Waste mines. Count to 3.
Ready? 1, 2, 3.
I couldn't do it.
Did you get it, Nikki?
Let me take one more.
Yes, agreed. Put the glasses back on.
It's my waste man's pose. It's hard to hold, okay, Nikki? Yeah.
Tell us when, Nikki.
Okay, I'm using a snipping tool because I don't know how to screenshot on this laptop. So, so hold. Okay, 3, 2, 1, and hold. Okay, I got it.
The way that you held that pose, I have to laugh.
Ridiculous. Feel free to add me on social media things. I'm John Orpheus on social media. So if you're looking for Antonio Michael Downing, you will not find him. Neither will OSAP. It's a real pleasure, guys. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Have a
Thank
good night.
you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Well, that is it. Woo! Sorry, guys, it went over a little bit.
It was worth it.
You're echoing.
Yes, I agree. I feel like that was a really nice kickoff. I mean, I feel for people that are new to the book club, it's definitely not our normal format. Obviously, when we have a guest speaker, it's a bit different and there's less of us chatting and more, well, you know, chatting with Lala, chatting with the author. I have no complaints. He was endearing and I loved every minute of that.
It was good.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So our next book is Honor, right?
Yep, that's right.
That one's a little heavy, so just fair warning, but it's a great read.
Amazing. And that will be end of November. Just sad and scary to think it will definitely be a lot colder then than it is now. So
Let's not talk about that.
bundle up for the coming 2 months. Happy reading. Feel free to share thoughts and ideas in the Facebook chat in the meantime.
Yep.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Lala.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Alrighty.
Oh, I see Julie put here, will you post the recording somewhere? Yes, I'll make sure to put that in it's going to go on our YouTube and then I'll share it out on all of our channels as well. Fran, it was great to have you.
Oh, it's great to be here. I'm very glad to have found this book club.
Yay. Well, we hope you'll stick around. There's been lots of people that have come back from season 1, so maybe you'll be an Antio book club frequent. It'd be great.
Yeah.
We'll see you in November.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Bye.
Bye.